Thank you very much, Terry, for a fantastically generous introduction. Could I first ask all those who know that they are volunteers to start moving and block all the exits, please? You know who you are. There are stewards and marshals waiting for you. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, you probably thought you'd already paid to come here. And I know that I haven't drawn the most popular straw in being the one who stands between you and Noam and the question and answer session, but the fact is that we at Covert Action Quarterly are quite old hands and have been in this business a long while, and we're not about to let a captive audience get away that lightly. We would like you to make a pledge, if you can, and we'll be passing buckets and baskets around for you to put money in, or IOUs, or checks, or any kind of paper currency. I don't know, for example, if I can just start the ball rolling here. How many people here would put their hands up and admit that they pay for home delivery of the Washington Post? That's quite a lot. I do it too. I reckon, what, $250 a year for that? I don't see why the government doesn't distribute it free, quite frankly. $250 to have a great wodge of consensus dumped on your doorstep. Now, if you'll pay $250 and not really notice it for that, the newspaper that publishes Henry Kissinger as an op-ed contributor, the newspaper of which I.F. Stone once rather brilliantly said, it's a great paper, the Washington Post, you never know on what page you'll find the front page story. That paper, who will put up their hand and say they'll give $250? They'll give the Washington Post equivalent. There you go, into the bucket it goes. Any more? Yes, excellent. Any more of those? Well, you can keep thinking about it. The offer is not, it was not going to expire with time. While you're writing your check or your pledge or your IOU or just tugging at your billfold, I'd just like to say a few things about our guest of honor tonight and about CAQ. I was rereading Norman Mailer's Armies of the Night recently in preparation for an interview I was doing with him, and I came across the wonderful passage where Mailer is arrested in the March on the Pentagon and is thrown into the wagon by the police, who then throw in a uniformed member of the US Nazi Party in along with him, just to show that the park police have a sense of humor. And as the sort of scene clears a bit, Mailer realizes that there's him and the Nazi and one other, a sort of thin, rather distant, bespectacled, slightly Jewish-looking sort of academic guy. And he says that it turns out to be Noam Chomsky. And when I interviewed him later, I said, that must have been an amazing encounter. He said, yes, at the time I had no idea who Noam Chomsky was. But Noam, of course, was from the first days of the anti-war movement, not just on the day of that great march on the Pentagon, but on many other days, important days too, in the very front rank, taking the side of the victim, calling an aggression by its right name, calling people to the responsibility, the realization that in such a case of aggression, you're morally obliged to stand with the victim. And that contribution, I think, will be remembered. He's often pessimistic about the historical record. I nonetheless think his contribution on that will always be remembered as quite literally imperishable. He was also there at the funeral of Fred Hampton. He was almost the only white face, I think, who was present at that funeral. The victim being an assassinated dissident, victim of a national political police force, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He went all the way to Managua to offer his solidarity in practical and moral forms as a lecturer and as a friend at the time of the hysterical war of aggression waged against Nicaragua by the Reagan administration. And he's also incredibly helpful, open, willing, and friendly for the least person who wants to consult him for research and scholarly purposes. I recently felt I had to do something about the Charles Murray-Richard Herrnstein phenomenon, the bell curve phenomenon, where it's suddenly discovered that the fault is not in the society, but in the genetic makeup of its lower orders. And I thought, well, probably Noam will have something to say about this. After all, he's studied the nature-nurture question rather intently, and I rang him up, said, what have you got? He said, well, I haven't got much recent, really, but I suppose I did write the paper about Richard Herrnstein. Herrnstein is really the author, the late Herrnstein, rather than Charles Murray, of the bell curve, a few years ago, and he sent me the most perfect and most prescient demolition of Richard Herrnstein that it was possible to imagine. This was at a time when everybody in the country was reviewing that damn book, and where the book was getting a really pretty extensive free ride, and where none of these insights, and none of these findings, and none of these areas of contestation were alluded to at all by the supposedly scholarly reviewers. But you only had to contact the man himself and to be, shall I say, without sounding fawning, enlightened. Noam has been the victim, he's not himself a victim of self-pity in any way, and wouldn't say this for himself, but I can tell you as someone who's followed it that he's been the victim of a really unprecedented campaign of calumny and defamation, and a parallel campaign to silence and exclude and marginalize his contributions. His books go unreviewed in the major outlets, his letters, often written in defense against appalling libels, are often unpublished or published in a mutilated form. I think he's born up under this with tremendous dignity and bearing and address. My Chomskyan syllogism, therefore, if I can venture such a thing, is that he has always been there for us, and Covert Action Quarterly will always be and is here for him, and so give generously. How's it going? Is there anyone who hasn't had the bag under their nose yet? There must be some people at the front, I think. All right, let's see. I want to increase the tempo of giving a little. If what I've just said doesn't move you or stir you, how much would you give to see Barbara Bush in the dock? Or any member of the Bush family. I'm offering you Barbara. I had to review her ghastly book the other day. You can always do something, you know, however small. I had to review this damn book for a stupid tabloid, reading through, and she said that Philip A.G. had given away the name of an American agent in Athens who'd later been assassinated and was morally responsible for this man's murder. And the introduction says that George Bush read every word of the book to protect her from having made any mistakes or committed any errors of fact. So I thought, I rang Phil in Hamburg. I said, I think you ought to sue her. And he is suing her. And they've already admitted that they're wrong. This is good. Anyone want the buckets back? Or write another pledge? He's going to sue. He's suing her for several $1 million. The publisher's already admitted, and the author, their guilt in the matter by changing this and excising the libel from the paperback. And our old friend Phil stands actually to be vindicated in an American court. And she might have to come there and take part in it. I'd say, what's that worth to you? I'd say that was worth a few bucks. It's one of those things that cheers you up. Give generously, in other words. When Phil first started writing about this kind of thing, it amazes me looking at his book now, the scandal that it caused. We had no idea. He thought it was bad. Phil A.G. helped us to find out how bad, but we and he had not the least idea how bad it really was. It's since his revelations that we've discovered about FRAP, that we've had Jennifer Harbury's revelations of the collusion, direct collusion between the CIA and the death squads in Guatemala, that we've had, brilliantly reported also in Covert Action Quarterly, the account of the CIA's part in the arrest of Nelson Mandela, the original arrest that led to his first trial and imprisonment, and the arrest of his wife, Winnie. We've had the Gladio revelations about the plans for military coups in every Western European country in the event of crisis. We've had the Ames fiasco, where it seems the taxpayers were paying to have the United States disinform itself, thus, I suppose, cutting out the middleman. And now the revelations that the crystal ball and stargazing faction is considered to be worth 17 million of anybody's money. I've always thought, often wondered why the Washington Post has an astrology column and a horoscope every day. Now I think I know, it was code. They were talking to each other through the Washington Post astrology columnist. Anyway, think about that and see how much money you can part with. CAQ has always had the goods on the foul collusion between the national security state in this country and a network of dictators and psychopathic killers who are ready to rent themselves out to them. I have very often been lucky enough to be able to recommend visiting journalists from overseas to go to the CAQ library, to go through the archive, to write stories in the foreign press, the sort that you never see here. It's a service they're very proud and glad to provide, and I'm incredibly proud and glad to be able to recommend. Great satisfaction comes of it. So what's it worth to you, is my question, as I hope we can have one more go round. Perhaps I can pluck one more heartstring, rifle one more pocket, open one more billfold. Did you see in the Washington Post yesterday that Dr. Michael Mandelbaum, great foreign policy pundit, of the Brookings Institution, has issued his final critique of the Clinton administration's foreign policy. This is one that not even Noam, I think, would have believed in his critique of our vulnerability to our own good intentions. But Dr. Mandelbaum really does say the problem with the Clinton administration and its foreign policies, it's so compassionate. It is the foreign policy, says this doctor at the Brookings Institution, of Mother Teresa. Now, if you take my view of Mother Teresa, which is that she's a valet du pouvoir, that she's a servant of right-wing thugs in power and right-wing businessmen on the make, and someone who likes to fool the poor, I suppose you could say that this was the foreign policy of Mother Teresa, but I don't think that was the implication about either her or President Clinton. But it is, I think, still, and perhaps no one will agree, that the benchmark remark about how we are really much too kind, much too sweet, much too altruistic, and much too forgiving. I will close with a story that I hope Noam will forgive me telling about him. As we all occasionally do, he had to go to the dentist not long ago, and the dentist said to him, "It's okay, your teeth are in good shape, but you're grinding them rather a lot, aren't you?" Noam said, "No, I'm not. I'm not aware of grinding them at all." "Well," said the dentist, "I've heard that before. Actually, what's happening, this is common too, is you're grinding them in your sleep." Noam thought, maybe I am. His wife and great partner, the wonderful Carol Chomsky, agreed to sort of have a round-the-clock Noam watch, just to sort of see what... He wasn't grinding them in his sleep. So they had a more intensive watch, and they found he was grinding them for a 15, 20-minute period every day in the morning while he was going through the New York Times. Now, I would just, in closing, therefore, recall for you the great closing words of the late martyr of the movement, Joe Hill. Don't grind, be like Noam, organize. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay, your turn. I think there's some mics up here. Yeah.
Dr. Chomsky, if you could discuss the current situation in Nicaragua and comments a bit on the split in the Sandinista movement and also the follies of the Chamorro government.
Well, let me give you two versions of what's going on in Nicaragua. One of them was given by Hillary Clinton, who was down there around mid-October. And I think she at least stopped at the airport. Maybe she saw something else. And she praised President Chamorro on having, I think her words were, reunified the Nicaraguan family and I don't control it. Close your eyes. I've been blinded for the last 2 hours or so. She praised them for revitalizing the economy and reunifying the Nicaraguan family. Very upbeat. I happened to be there at the time. I have a daughter and grandson there, and I was visiting. And a couple of days before, about 3 or 4 days earlier, there's an ultra-right newspaper, the newspaper of the business community, the big, glossy newspaper of the business community, La Tribuna, and they had an article which was on a UNICEF report that had just come out, which I haven't seen reported here, on Nicaragua, and their headline said, "Nicaragua is mortgaging its future and may be destroyed." Why? Because 75% of families live in extreme poverty. 25% of children suffer severe malnutrition. A third of children between 6 and 9 don't go to school. The country is collapsing and has been falling into total ruin since the United States took it over in 1990. So there's two versions. You can pick the version of UNICEF and the right-wing business community in Nicaragua, or you can pick Hillary Clinton's version. In fact, there are a lot of third world countries, if you've been around the third world, where it is possible to sort of drive around and think you're in a rich country. I mean, in Cairo, for example, you can go from the airport to the fancy hotel on the Nile and, you know, some fancy restaurant and so on, and you'd think you're on, you know, Upper West Side Manhattan or wherever the rich area of Manhattan is, I don't know, or the equivalent part of Washington. You can do that, but Managua not one of them. You can't go 2 blocks without seeing that the country is desperate, without having your car surrounded by starving street waifs asking for a penny. Or seeing that, you know, the place is falling to pieces. And if you bother looking any further, you see that it's not impossible, as a few Nicaraguan environmentalists are fearing, that the country may be uninhabitable in a couple of decades because people are so poor that they're forced to go up and cut trees, and there's deforestation in a relatively underpopulated and resource-rich area, to the extent that lakes are beginning to dry up and rivers are drying up and there's environmental catastrophes and so on. And that's after a decade of, whatever you think about the Sandinistas, no doubt, of rather significant progress. By Central American standards, astonishing progress. Well, okay, you can take your choice about what's happening. I've already forgotten the second half of the question.
Well, the split in the Sandinista movement.
Split in the Sandinistas. Well, I mean, the Sandinistas have plenty to answer for. The good thing about the Sandinistas, I was very critical of them myself, as some of you will know, right through the 80s, and we had plenty of conflicts, but there was one good thing about them, several good things about them. First of all, they didn't go around massacring everybody, which by the standards of our colonies is already pretty good, you know, so they get a couple of points for that. Secondly, they did provide space in which other people could do things. So if people wanted to carry out health programs or, you know, to make a school for the poor or a cooperative or something, yeah, they'd help them out, and they could do it. Again, by the standards of our dependencies, that's unheard of. In fact, kind of hard to find here. But so there were good things about them. On the other hand, they were authoritarian, and they robbed, and they, you know, did plenty of ugly things. Right now, the party has split. Split is a funny word for it. I mean, the official party, which has almost every, at least by the polls, that's almost all of the people who support it, is the Ortega faction. Sergio Ramirez, who I should say is a personal friend, is separated. He was the vice president. He's now running he's kind of like a mainstream social democrat. Is got a separate grouping. That's the Sandinista split. Exactly what it means in the situation of the country is very hard to say. It doesn't make any sense to interpret the results of elections in Central America for very well-known reasons, very well-understood reasons, which were pointed out years ago by Central American Jesuits. And that is, as they pointed out, that the culture of terror has domesticated people's aspirations. You just place people under repeated terror year after year, and it domesticates their aspirations. They don't even hope for anything anymore. You've killed hope in the title of a recent book by somebody who's here. And that's the great achievement of the United States, to have killed hope. So people just sort of try to find survival strategies. And hence the results of elections are almost meaningless, even when people vote.
May I ask that you restate the question, because these microphones
sorry.
are not wired into the loop system.
Oh,
Thank you.
I see. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll try to keep the question very brief. You alluded to the fact that the U.S. has cut back on the foreign aid and cutting back to the UN because the Cold War is over and they don't have to give the bribes out anymore. And then you said you were going to...
That's not what I said.
Well, no, it's not
We never
exactly.
gave bribes out.
Right, okay, that's true. That's true.
We always had the most miserly aid program.
Right, that's true. But that it has something to do with the end of the Cold War, and that the domestic situation also has something to do with the end of the Cold War, you know, having to do with the fact that you don't need the labor movement anymore to subvert the labor movements overseas, and of course you don't need the labor movement at all because you've got slave labor around the world and so on. What I wanted to ask is, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what you're going to talk about tomorrow for those of us who are going to be snowbound?
Oh, didn't know about the snow. If you're snowbound, I'll be too. The question was, I was asked to repeat the questions. I think there's a little bit of misinterpretation, but let me state the question as it was stated, and then I'll try to deal with the misinterpretation, maybe my fault. I the questioner said that I had implied, or maybe said, that the end of the Cold War has led to a cutback in U.S. aid because it's not necessary to bribe countries, and it's led to an attack on the labor movement because we no longer need the labor movement to undermine labor in other countries and other things like that, and then was asked for a thumbnail sketch of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow for those of you who are snowbound. That's news to me. I thought it never snowed in Washington. First of all, I didn't say, if I implied, it was my fault, but I didn't mean to imply that these things had to do with the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War has happened, but I think that's a very minor factor in what's going on. These changes have been going on very dramatically for about 25 years, and they have to do with big changes in the international economy. The huge explosion of financial capital ever since Richard Nixon dismantled the Bretton Woods system and the system of regulated capital, which is an extraordinary phenomenon, the increased possibilities of globalization of production. I mean, there's a number of things that have gone on. It's true that the end of the Cold War contributed to them. The end of the Cold War contributed to them primarily. Here I think you have to think about what the Cold War was about. In my view, that's mostly misinterpreted. In my view, the Cold War was just a very overblown case of a North-South conflict. It's kind of like the U.S. conflict with Grenada, to go to the opposite extreme. But of course, there's a big difference between a speck in the Caribbean that you can't find in a sixth of the world. One of them you get rid of in a weekend, and the other takes 70 years. But the structure is quite similar. Russia and Eastern Europe generally were third world, deeply impoverished third world areas for the most part. Parts were part of the West, and they're going back to the West, like the Czech Republic and Western Poland. Yeah, that was part of the West, and that's going back to the West. Most of it was deeply impoverished third world countries, in fact, the original third world. You know, it started splitting from Western Europe around the 15th century, getting increasingly more deeply impoverished as the West began to develop, and its service area, kind of like the relation between us and Mexico or something like that. Well, there's some rules of international conduct. One major rule is that no part of the third world, the South so-called, is allowed to strike an independent course. That's not permitted. They have a function. Their function is to serve. If they try to carry out an independent course, whether it's, you know, fishing cooperatives in Grenada or a populist program in Haiti, or, you know, you name it, you know, clinics and healthcare in Nicaragua, they got to be smashed, because that's not permitted. When it's in a sixth of the world, even more. And in fact, the U.S. attack, the Western attack, began in 1918. That's when the Cold War began. And Russia wasn't conquering anybody, whatever you thought about it. There's a second rule of international affairs, and that is it's bad enough to strike an independent course, it's worse to apparently succeed. Now, succeed means maybe not, you know, there's no objective measure of success. Success means succeed in a way which will motivate others to try to do the same thing. And the fear of Russia from 1918 right until the mid-1960s, and that's when our record runs dry. You know, we don't have a declassified record after that. But from 1918 right away until the early 1960s, the great fear was that they were successful, that they were having a demonstration effect that others would want to follow. And in fact, if you think realistically, that's not mistaken. People here say, look what a horror it was, compare it to Western Europe. It's true, it was a total horror. But to compare it with Western Europe is absolute insanity. You know, I mean, that's like saying that the Cambridge, Massachusetts kindergartens are a failure. And proof, ask how much quantum physics the kids know as compared with the ones getting their PhDs at MIT. I mean, that's not even insane, you know. You want to compare Eastern Europe and something, compare it with something that was comparable before this took place. So say compare Russia and Brazil, or compare Bulgaria and Guatemala, or something like that. That's a sane comparison. And there's a good reason why nobody undertakes it. If you have a look at Brazil and Guatemala and the rest of them, you'll see why nobody undertakes that comparison. Except people in the third world who don't have good educations like us, they do make that comparison. And planners in the United States always made that comparison in the West, and they were afraid of what they found, that in comparison with what we're doing, this stuff looks pretty successful, and others are going to try to follow it, and that Henry Kissinger had a word for it. It's a virus that'll infect others. He was talking about Chile under Allende. It was going to be a virus that would infect people as far as Italy, not because Chile was going to conquer Italy, but because it would send the wrong message to Italian voters, namely you can vote for a social democratic system and maybe it'll work. And when there's a virus, you got to destroy it and inoculate everything around it, and that's what we did. You look over that, that's basically the Cold War. Okay, it's over. So Eastern Europe goes back to what it was, pretty much, not 100%. But the parts that were part of the West are becoming part of the West. The parts that were third world are becoming third world. And that does contribute to these other phenomena. It means in fact, you read the business press, they're very frank about it. The business press, which is the best place to, if you want to read the press, that's the one that usually comes close to telling you the truth. They tell you that with Eastern Europe now back in its third world situation, or to put it, let me quote from the Financial Times in London, the world's greatest business newspaper, with the impoverishment and pauperization of East Europe as a result of the capitalist reforms, the Western investors can now move their production over to Eastern Europe and undermine the pampered Western workers who will be forced to give up their luxurious lifestyles. So now, in other words, not only can GM and VW and so on invest in Mexico and Brazil and so on, but they can also do it in Poland, where they furthermore get well-educated, healthy, trained people, because this part of the third world did develop, and they can do it at 10% the cost of the pampered Western European workers without any benefits. And incidentally, since none of these guys believe in the free market and never have, the free market is for others, not for yourself, they insist on high tariff protection and subsidies from the government and the usual stuff that comes along with foreign investment. So in that respect, yes, it's another weapon in the hands of Western power to undermine the pampered Western workers. So yes, the Cold War has an effect, but it's not a big effect. And as with regard to aid, it's virtually nothing. What am I going to talk about tomorrow? Well, what I'm going to talk about tomorrow is the rollback on the domestic scene. I think it's going on. The United States is in effect being subjected to a kind of a structural adjustment program. It's being turned into a third world society. Now it's so rich. It has so many advantages. In fact, it's totally unparalleled. This ought to be by far the most richest country. If there's one hungry child in the United States, the socioeconomic system is a total catastrophe, given the wealth of this country. It's not like other places. You want to know how wealthy it is? I'll give you just one figure. In the 18th century, the life expectancy of Americans, that level of life expectancy was not reached by the upper classes in Britain until this century, the next richest people in the world. That's one measure of the extraordinary privileges and advantages that there are here. And in fact, so we're being turned into a kind of third world society, but it's the United States, it's not Haiti. And that's happening all over. You can't walk through any American city without recognizing a third world city, sector of great opulence, a large group of people, actually the majority, who are suffering or maybe in misery, and a big mass of superfluous people you have to get rid of.
Where are you going to be tomorrow?
All Souls Church, wherever it is. Anyway, that's what I'll be doing.
Professor Chomsky, it's an honor to share again this time and space with you. As your greatest student, I had to inquire the technique of our intellectual endeavor. We ought to review the responsibility of intellect, that is the uncorruptible one. Why have we failed to persuade the majority at center to take the necessary action, disengaging themselves from this benign and normalization of evil, also as known as cultural relativism, that has historically haunted our condition. And here's a case in point Richard Wolling's reply to your letter. Richard Wolling, W-O-L-I-N. You wrote a letter.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And he says, despite the considered political and culture means at the disposal of opinion makers and politicians, most citizens remain contra Chomsky, surprisingly capable of penetrating the veil of deceit and making up their own minds. Then so what if all citizens are aware? It has a repression from the systematic mechanism of economic political control enslave us to the rich and the powerful.
Mm-hmm. So the question is why, you know, why we are, if I got it correctly, why we're unable to convince the majority of people to look at things the way we think the world is, and are the mechanisms of control so powerful that it can't be broken?
I believe our technique ought to be looked at too and see.
Yeah. See, I don't agree with the assumption. I think most of the population's on our side. In fact, I think the evidence is overwhelming about that. So take, for example, like I mentioned one case. I only mentioned one case, in fact, when I was talking about public opinion and policy. I mentioned several cases. Just take the case I mentioned. One of them is the Vietnam War. That's a big issue. There has been, by now, 40, 50 years of intense propaganda about the Vietnam War, all of which says it was a noble effort that maybe went wrong. 70% of the population says it was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Despite that massive propaganda, despite never having heard anyone say that, meaning everyone picked it up on their own somehow. Take, say, the Pentagon budget, the one part of the budget that's going up. Well, the population, I'm against that, and so are the population by 6 to 1. That's not a small amount. Take, say, budget balancing, a big thing. You know, we're all supposed to assume and take for granted that you got to balance the budget. In fact, the political system is bounded. You know, there are differences. Some guys say 7 years, some guys say 8 years. You know, so that's and then you debate that in the political system, and you listen to NPR, and they tell you Americans voted for a balanced budget, and so on. Well, the fact of here are the polls you got to look at a little bit carefully, because they're well crafted. There's one question asked for headline writers. And there's another question asked for people who want to know what public opinion is like, so you know how to frame the messages in which you deceive people. And those are different questions. The question for the headline writers is, would you like a balanced budget? And most everybody says, sure. You know, that's like asking people, would you like your mortgage to disappear? Terrific, you know. I like my mortgage to disappear. So you get a big, high number. Okay, that's for NPR and, you know, the editorial writers and so on. Everybody wants a balanced budget. Then comes the other question, which is for the propagandists who have to figure out how to frame this so people don't know what's hitting them. And that says, would you like, that begins to ask the rational questions. Like, would you want your household debts eliminated if it means giving up your house or your car or your children's education and so on? Well, then everybody says, no, I don't want a balanced household budget anymore. So when you ask that question, the sane question, do you want the budget balanced if it means cuts in health expenditures or, you know, social spending or environment and so on? Well, then population's opposed by, you know, 3 to 1 or something, depending on exactly how the question is framed. So in fact, the population is overwhelmingly opposed to a balanced budget. Now, you're not allowed to know that. You're supposed to think everybody wants a balanced budget. You know, Clinton, when he responds to the Republicans, says, of course, we have to balance the budget. You know, okay, well, they're the population again. And in fact, you know, you could ask the question, who's right? I mean, there is a factual question. Is the population right, or is the whole political elite right? Well, you know, I think there's good evidence about that, and I think the population is right, but that's another question. In fact, let me just end with this. Not only do I think the population's on our side, so does the right-wing Congress. So does the Wall Street Journal. They all think the population's on our side. And there's proof of it. Actually, my latest had an article in Covert Action Quarterly where I ended up giving some evidence about this. The evidence that I cited was there's a program in Congress called Defunding the Left. Okay, and you know, the Wall Street Journal has big articles about it, how we got to defund the left. And Congress is pushing through, you know, legislation which will defund the left. Well, take a look at who they've got to defund. And what they're worried, they say, is really terrible. The government's funding all these left-wing organizations. We've got to stop that. All right, take a look at the list. The top organization of the left that has to be defunded is Catholic Charities. The reason why is because there are priests and nuns who, for nothing, are going out and working with poor people to try to help them deal with the fact that they don't have any heating for their homes and to help in Head Start programs. So we've got to defund the left and stop giving money to Catholic Charities. The second biggest program is AARP, American Association of Retired People. You know, another big left-wing organization. Why do they have to be defunded? Well, they have to be defunded, it's explained, because they happen to have a program that's trying to help elderly people who are hungry get work. Now, in fact, the Wall Street Journal had another article saying that 16% of the elderly are severely malnutritioned and many are literally starving. But AARP is trying to work out some kind of program for them to get some work, so that's another left-wing organization that has to be defunded. And so it goes on. In fact, if you have a look at it, it turns out that the left is everybody who is not pathologically insane. You know, that's a pretty large number of people. You know, so in fact, they think the whole left is that you know that we won. You know, that we've got everybody on our side. And in fact, I don't think that's completely wrong. It's not that the propaganda system has, you know, turned everybody into a raving lunatic. No, it hasn't. People keep their decent instincts, but they are very confused. I mean, the same people who say the government should increase, you know, the majority of the population says the government has a responsibility to help the poor, but another majority of the population says the government should end welfare. Well, you know, what's welfare? Well, helping the poor. And here's where the propaganda system has worked. I mean, it's convinced people that we're giving away all our money, you know, we're giving all our money to foreigners, we're giving our money to black women driving Cadillacs and, you know, that kind of stuff. And that kind of confusion is all over the place. And people don't know what they want, and they don't know what they think, but they know what their attitudes are. And their attitudes are pretty sane.
Professor, but you must admit that the situation have not changed. And matter of fact, I think it got worse.
What do you mean the situation has not changed?
Have not changed.
Since when? I mean, do we have slavery?
Oh, in the form
of so no, the situation's changed a lot. In fact, the situation's changed a lot in our lifetimes for the better. It's a much better country than it was 30 years ago. Way better. That's a very important... A meeting like this could not have been held. Inconceivable that it could have been held 30 years ago. And now it can be held everywhere in the country, the most reactionary place in the country with huge mobs and everybody's interested and so on and so forth. Those are big changes. And they reflect all sorts of things that have happened in the country, not because, you know, people were writing articles or reading books or anything like that, because plenty of people are organizing. And they're organizing because they know things, and they're learning things, and they're contributing by their actions to other people learning things and so on. That has changed the country. And there's plenty of room for further change. You know, things go up and back, like now it's worse than it was a couple of years ago, but that's happened before too. 1920s were worse than now. So, okay,
one easy
keep
question.
struggling.
It's my unhappy duty to inform you that our contract calls for us to close down 10 minutes ago. So I'm really sorry. I thank you all very, very much for coming. Thank you, Professor Chomsky.